Welcome back to another episode of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, the CEO of Close Strong. And today I'm really lucky to be with Shawn Pillow, who is the Director of Sales Enablement at Granicus. Shawn, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Brian. And it's great to be with you today.
So our topic for those who are listening in today is decision making and how that's a key skill for enterprise sales folks. And Shawn, you and I were chatting the other day and kind of wandered into this idea of decision making being a key skill in enterprise sales. Why do you think that is?
Yes, it's a couple things, right? When you're selling in the enterprise environment, whether that's an enterprise deal or you're selling into, a small sector of an enterprise, the decisions you make have a much bigger impact. There's much bigger opportunity cost to them. And so if you're doing a higher volume of sales, you know that maybe a third of your customers don't fit your ideal client profile. You can take some risks. If you pursue a strategy that doesn't work out that well, you haven't really lost that much time. You may not have really hurt your reputation with people that were never going to be good customers in the first place. And in the enterprise space, that's just not the same, especially because your buyers move around from one organization to the next. And so how you spend your time, the conscious ways that you interact with people, it's just magnified in that environment.
Yeah, you know it. What do I'm trying to think of what sort of newscasters do sometime when someone they're interviewing is like a cousin or something. I will say that I used to teach decision making, so when you brought this up, I'm just like it's also near and dear to my heart, and it's funny too because when my stepsons were 12, 13, someone did this exercise with me. They had me write an epitaph of not what people would, what I wanted them to say, or not what they would say, but what I wanted them to say at the end of my life. And it changed my view of the world. And I had my stepson to do it, and then went back to them, Shawn, and said, every decision you guys make every single day is either in the direction of your whole life journey or not. So yeah, I mean, this thing to both of us is like crazy important thing. And to that end, do you think there's enough formal training for enterprise salespeople, for leaders around this kind of core life skill?
No, but to your point just there, and the eye-opening moment that you had, I don't think anyone in any profession gets enough formal decision-making training.
Yes.
Around that.
Yeah.
For instance, my wife is a cardiothoracic surgeon. She has a particular skill that she is absolutely excellent at. But in making other decisions, when she's thinking about negotiating future employment contracts, things like that, no one's taught her how to do that, right? And certainly enterprise sellers, sales leaders in even like product and project management organizations, they don't get taught to make decisions.
Yep.
Unless you've gone to business school or you studied psychology. And even then, you may have been taught all the factors that people consider when making a decision.
Yeah.
But the decision making is an act.
Yeah.
It's not just a process. At some point, you can keep gathering information and you might go from 88% certainty to 88.1% certainty. But back to the opportunity cost, how much time did you lose getting that extra 10th of a percentage of certainty that you're going in the right direction?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because having taught decision making and negotiation, the reason I did both of those things, the base science, there's a few base sciences, but the key was game theory, right? The kind of study of interdependent strategies and what happens and the useful threads of those are like either war strategy or playing cards. But in business, it's negotiation and decision making. It's interesting that you tie your wife's kind of negotiation of a contract to decisions she was making, because it's very weird, and we could do a whole show on that they're almost the same. Negotiation is two sides making a decision to accept a rejected deal. So yeah, you just kind of prompted that in my head.
Yeah, it's funny when you think about it that way too. Like, a lot of times, we use that example of trying to get 1% more certain in a negotiation. If I make a decision that, let's say I tell an enterprise customer, you know what, I don't think that you're ready to do business with us, I've decided it's not a profitable way for us to continue, interacting right now. You might suddenly get to 95% certainty
Yeah.
because they say, hey, actually, let me put my cards back on the table. Let's have a different type of discussion, right? And it's actually really respectful to do
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
It's a decision, but you have to feel comfortable making it. Someone has to have taught you how to get to that point of feeling comfortable, creating an environment where you feel empowered to make a decision like that, because that can be a big risk,
Yeah.
right?
It's
To
in,
tell your
yeah.
VP of sales, hey, I walked away from this customer.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think they're ready.
Yeah, but here's how I made the decision. Yeah, it's so the more I talk to you about this, and I think is this a kind of nature or nurture? Like some people are pretty good at this, but this is a skill that can be taught. So it's frustrating, I think, to both of us. Back to that previous question, that this isn't being injected into management, into sales, like this skill, because again, it has so much to do with success. So my next question has to do. We talked about both like internal decision making and external decision making with customers. Let's talk about internal. What's your perspective on how one can improve their internal decision making? What are those decisions? What does that look like to make that better?
Yeah. So I think there's two parts. So the first part is you have to be genuinely and intensely curious
Hmm.
about your coworkers. One of the things that I think a lot of people, regardless of profession, and salespeople in particular, make a mistake in doing is they assume that everyone else has incentives that are aligned with them. And in a perfectly designed, scientific organization, everyone has incentives that are aligned. It's like an engine that operates at 100% efficiency,
Yeah.
right? But any engineering student can tell you that that's not how engines operate, right? There's always friction in the system. So when you have that genuine curiosity and you can interrogate those sources of friction, then you can identify like where a little bit of give on your part will actually return you a tremendous amount of goodwill from someone in another department.
Yeah.
I had early in my sales career, I had a client success team member who I was paired with. And my initial inclination was every time a customer reached out to me because they had an issue, I would just copy her into the thread and say, great, Amy will help you with this, right? And what I learned over time was that Amy actually had a really strong incentive to refer me business from my existing customer base. So if I just spent a couple of minutes looking through the knowledge base to answer that customer's question on her behalf and blind carbon copy her on the email, wow, what a decision that made, and what a difference it made in how suddenly 0% of my number was being referred to me through client services. And then, oh, all of a sudden it's a quarter of my bookings
Yeah.
every quarter,
Yeah.
like clockwork.
Yeah.
And, you know, then when I moved to a new team, that decision carried through, right? Okay, new team members, new supporting staff, new market. Learn how everyone else is oriented, how they operate, what they have an incentive to do, and feel comfortable making decisions and demonstrating that situational leadership.
Yeah.
I might have a great manager, but maybe my peer in another department doesn't. So by being decisive and bringing them along and shouldering some of that risk for a decision, I can be a leader and a manager to them as a peer that they may not be getting from their superior.
Yeah, it's you just brought an idea to my mind. I was fortunate enough to work for Marriott International, a hotel company, for many years, and I didn't work directly for Bill Marriott, but I was lucky enough to sit in a lot of meetings with him. And we were making a tough call once on a bunch of franchisees that had our brand up on the building, and they weren't doing well. And we were trying to make the decision between the fees that came from these buildings and the impact on the brand. And Bill Marriott said to us, we were wrestling with this thing, and he said, every decision you make is a deposit into or a withdrawal from brand equity. And he left the room. Our decision, and
Wow.
that's what just hit me, that like you were making decisions about personal brand equity. And when he said that and left the room, boom, we were done. It was easy. Yank the flags, forget the fees, yank the flags. So
Right.
it just occurs to me, just yet another story about how someone with superior decision making skills came in and gently schooled us to make the right call.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. And think about how that strikes a customer too. When you as a seller are making a decision about your time, like your ability to engage with them, and establishing this doesn't make sense
Right.
because especially in that enterprise environment, this doesn't make sense, doesn't translate to this will never make sense, means that right now this is not a good use of either of our time.
Right.
And as an enterprise seller in particular, that personal brand equity is incredibly important.
I wonder if you
Right?
find, yeah, for sure. And again, I love this subject so much that you keep bringing things to mind. I've often found in making decisions that, there's an Eastern philosophical idea called the middle way. And when you're trying to choose between A and or B, left and or right, there usually is a middle. And I just wonder on the like soft skills side of that, do you see that sometimes the best decision is neither this nor that, but something in the middle?
Yeah, I think it's so hard, right? I think this is why that rule of, 80/20 or 90/10, whatever rule you want about having some level of confidence about making a decision, that that strive to be perfect, to make the perfect decision and make
Right.
the perfect call every time. It's a really worthy desire. And
Yes.
there's an adage, right? Or a joke, whatever you want to
Yeah.
refer to it as. Oh, it's the perfect compromise. Both sides are a little bit unhappy.
Right.
And the reality is you've found that middle way
Yeah.
of achieving an outcome
Yeah.
and ultimately making a decision, living with a compromise, living with an outcome that, maybe isn't exactly what you were hoping for, what it wasn't the perfect decision,
Yeah.
is at least a decision, and you make progress and you give yourself that opportunity to iterate and get closer than you would have if you spent time
Yeah. It's
um,
another thing.
considering it.
Yeah, another thing that comment brings to mind is my old business partner and current friend Max Bazerman, who's a negotiation professor at Harvard, often talked about that decision to split the difference. That people often say that's fair, and his point is no, it might be a good way to resolve the thing, but it doesn't mean it's fair, especially if the thing you're splitting is all whacked out in the first place. So just another example of where that comes in. So let's talk about maybe some of the obvious stuff, which is downside to poor decision making internally. Again, I think it's low hanging fruit, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the downside, to get back to kind of where we started about why it's a key skill, the downside is that in an enterprise sales environment, you are not out there on your own. I mean, sure, of course, every now and then you find a lone wolf
Yep.
who doesn't need their manager, they don't need solution consulting. The reality is an enterprise sale is best executed when it's a team effort. And so because you have finite resources, not just your own time, but all of those people in supporting departments, the more that you are willing to protect their time and value their time, the more successful you're likely to be. And so the downside of making poor decisions or failing to make any decision and dragging on for 6 months, 9 months, a year before you ultimately make a tough decision is people feel like you've wasted their
Right.
time, their energy, their talent.
Yeah.
You've reduced your brand equity, and now you've reduced your ability to go back to that person next time around when you have the prospect of a better decision in front of you,
Yes.
and you've got to repair that trust, right?
Yeah, and isn't it so? So the upside, then my next question is about sort of tangible benefits to doing it well. But again, your thoughtful responses are stirring so much in me. One is that a series of good decisions, like there's a certain amount of credibility, right? That you build, especially when you make the tough calls
That's
that
right.
aren't always self-serving. Yeah, there's a certain reputation or credibility that you build up internally or externally with customers.
Yeah, and you get that opportunity again to demonstrate that situational leadership through making good decisions. And, when you burn that goodwill over time, ultimately that manifests in poor performance.
Yeah.
And sales leaders in the enterprise are not going to have a tremendous amount of tolerance for poor performance because how long does it take to backfill that seat, to train that next seller, to for that person to feel comfortable in that environment? Like there's another opportunity cost there.
Yes.
And way too often, you know, in any environment, we fall victim to that sunk cost fallacy. Oh, you know what? Those weren't great decisions, but this next decision is going to be the one that turns it, right? Like, you know, how many people are sitting at the blackjack table in Vegas right now,
Yeah.
even
No,
still,
you
making decisions like that, right?
yes, you just did it to me again, and I'm going to go back to Max Bazerman at Harvard. Max says, "Look, on average in Vegas, you lose. It's just a mathematical fact, but yet people keep going back there." And he says, "Because every now and then I won." Right?
Yeah,
So,
that's right. Because those things stick out more,
yeah,
more clearly in our mind.
yeah,
And it's not an easy thing, right? So when I got the opportunity to study under Dan Ariely, he's a behavioral economist, written a tremendous number of books on the subject. And after a year, he had a column that he turned into a book called Irrationally Yours, about how to make rational
right.
decisions. And finally, like right before the pandemic, he released a book called Amazing Decisions. And it's like a comic book to try to
Hmm.
illustrate how difficult it is for us in everyday environments to make good decisions,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And it is a skill, but some of it just requires some intention,
yes,
recognizing your own bias, right? Like, well, I don't want to pay for the entire dinner tonight, and then next time they'll get it, right?
yeah,
Even though that's a perfectly rational decision, we psychologically get a lot out of that decision.
yeah.
But in the moment, sometimes we don't make a good one.
Yeah, and
It's hard,
it's
right?
yes, and when you talk about bias, there is the confirmation bias, right, where you make a decision and then you go and looking for all the supporting data. And one thing that changed my mind on making decisions when I read, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this for scientists, but the scientific method is looking for disconfirming, an active search for disconfirming data, and that is you have to make a choice to go blow holes in your own strategy. And yeah, again, you resurrected this notion that it's a key decision making skill, I think.
I think you honed in on one part there, which is you have to have a hypothesis as well before you come to the table. Like you have to say, if these circumstances are true, then I can deliver value for this customer.
Yeah,
And too often we only do the second part of I can deliver value to this customer, right? There should be a conditional there,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so we don't even think about trying to prove or disprove.
yeah. A very easy, and I want to move on to customer decision making in a moment, but a really easy filter that I learned from someone else and used is to ask the question, to what end, when you're getting ready to make a decision, to what end. And I do this, and I do this with my wife all the time, and like especially if we're mad at somebody, it's like, all right, we're going to launch this email or do this thing, and it's like, to what end? What's really, other than in the moment taking that shot feels good, how is this going to play out over the next 3 rounds? And if like in the simple, if anyone's here and never had any training, I think that's one of like the best, to ask the to what end of almost anything you're doing.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. A friend of mine used to be a sales manager I worked with, Dustin Brinkman. He, when he would talk to his sellers about decisions their customers were making, decisions that they were making, I think he even had a sign in his office that just said "So what," to emphasize it, just those two
I
words.
love
So what?
that. Yep.
Like, what's the point? How does this get us closer to the goal? Do we know what the goal is?
Yeah.
Right.
So
Uh,
yeah, let's
so
finish this up on a heady subject in question, which is really focusing on using those skills as it relates to working with customers. How do you think it helps us sell, to have improved sort of external skills?
so I think the first thing is we value our time, we value our resources um, more preciously. We treat them as the scarcities that they are. One of the best interviews I ever sat through with an enterprise seller, when he was asked about his strategy, he said, "I think about the fact that I have 40 hours each week to deploy
Yeah.
against getting closer to my quota.
Yeah.
and what decisions I make about how I use those hours is really critical.
Yep.
And so when we start to think about that, especially when we look at large organizations, complex organizations, looking at the trends and the number of people getting involved in buying decisions, there are a lot of people who may waste our time,
Yes.
not intentionally.
Right. Right.
There's no malice or anything like that, but it may not be a good or productive use of time to spend time with them. So, I think one of the things increasingly is happening is we're all eager to get back together and meet each other in person. Tremendous, really great thing. So a customer invites you to go meet with them. And your instinct is to say, yeah, of course, I am on the next flight. I got somebody to take care of the dog. Someone, the rest of my family can manage. I am there. I'm on my way. Is that the best use of our time?
Yeah.
What's the intention? How are we going? How is that going to move us towards a productive partnership? How does that help that customer achieve that business goal?
Yeah.
Or am I just eager to go do that because I got an invitation and so I feel this desire to say yes? Yeah. So making that decision in the moment to say, hey, I would love when the time is right to go spend time with you. But before I do that, I would like to talk to this person and that person.
Right.
I need to know this information. What about you? How does this play into all of the other things that are happening in your organization? When we can demonstrate that decision to value our time appropriately, that's how you build trust, because it communicates that you are also in turn going to value the time, the energy, the talent, and ultimately the capital that they deploy towards a partnership.
Yep. Yeah, you mentioned kind of time management, especially with enterprise sellers, like, it being so critical. And I remember another guidepost that I got from somewhere else years ago about that doing two things every morning as it relates to decisions. One, what are my priorities for the day? And then what is the time allocation for each priority? And then look, and you might go to priority 2 because that's only going to take 10 minutes and you get that off your list. And I'm telling you, man, that still guides me almost every day. I have a list right here to my right and I have the priorities, not necessarily time allocation. I can look at it and go, all right, that one's third, but I can bang that out quick. And it's such an easy way to make conscious decisions all day long with your time.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. But you have to treat how you spend your time as a decision.
Yes.
In order to be able to get to that, like, practitioner.
Yes.
That level of being a practitioner, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, if I get nothing else done today but these things, or, I find myself increasingly doing this, I'm going to tell this person that this meeting is not a priority for me.
Yeah.
Not today, not this week, maybe not this month. And they're going to be upset. And I'm going to make that decision consciously because I know that ultimately it aligns with, the priorities of my organization, and other priorities that I might have.
It's such an,
and too often,
go ahead.
Too often, especially as a seller, maybe you let your morning get full of meetings that are less important, but you have a really critical meeting in the afternoon. You have some really critical time with a customer, or you need to set aside some time for critical thought and deep thinking as you prepare a proposal or you go to spend time with a customer. Being intentional about what you do, when you do it, and how, really helpful.
Yeah, you make me realize what a beneficial management construct this is, and I think about some of the team that I work with, especially some that are like 1099s, and we're trying to agree on sort of how many hours, and I just realized that my point to them many times is I really don't care how many hours you work. It's about production. It's about getting those priorities done. If we get those done and you get those done in half a week, I'm not really concerned because what we're paying for are these outputs. And I think we put way too much emphasis on the hours. So you mentioned something a moment ago, Shawn, that I want to go back to, which is so really valid. If you look at any of the data out there on enterprise selling, that I think there's 6.7 people per buy. I'm still not sure exactly how you get to the 0.7 person, but and that it's a committee buy, and that customers are struggling making decisions because it is so complex. The solutions we're selling, the problems are more complex. There's more people involved, and and no decision now, it has been growing the last couple of years, and the argument in the research, it's tied to complexity. So it makes me realize that as we talk about your external customer facing decision making skills, they're struggling with this.
Yeah, I think we have more data now that shows that there is like increasing no decision. I think certainly the number of people involved is increasing in the sales cycle. I think there's a lot of reasons for that,
Yeah.
not just indecision. I think some of that is that there's a necessity to get people more involved as we think about. I was just talking to someone the other day about the dangers of like a supply chain hack, like what happened with SolarWinds, right?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden the question becomes, oh, what were we doing to prevent that? Oh, well, we just naturally need more people to get involved to think through the implications of that decision. Maybe they won't actually make it, but they just need to be aware of it so that they can plan for it, et cetera. So they become part of our buying committee in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily impact us as a salesperson, but it is something we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
Um, so I think people are struggling to make decisions for sure, but I think a lot of that comes down to, in a lot of ways, we're not thinking about making a decision as an act.
Yes.
We think that if we do all of these things, at some point the decision just presents
Yeah.
itself, right? And especially in a group environment, I've been with groups of friends, small groups of friends. You're picking a restaurant. I can send out links to places in the Michelin Guide all day. It doesn't necessarily get us closer to a decision,
Right.
right? At some point, there needs to be an act,
Yes.
and I think that's fundamentally the challenge.
I also,
So that person who sees a few options and says, "Nope, that's the one we're going."
yes.
Like they get to demonstrate that situational leadership of, okay, we've got the options. Here's what we're going to do.
Right. Right. And I absolutely know you're and agree with this. It's that other adage that just comes to mind, that sometimes not making the decision is a proactive decision that you're making. It isn't the right time. I don't have enough data. And it's not, kind of a bad thing, or you're being wishy-washy. It's like, I am deciding right now to not make this call.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah, I sometimes have been accused of being decisive by virtue of being impatient. But again, there's an opportunity cost for that time that you lose trying to agonize over making something perfect.
Yeah.
My first boss, one of her key points to me, because she saw me trying to make everything perfect, was don't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Yes.
Here. Like, make a decision, get started, refine it later.
Yeah.
Same thing with, as a seller, when you're thinking through your account plan or your territory plan for the year, you could spend 100 hours trying to make the world's greatest territory plan. But how many of those hours would have been better spent getting started, building some traction, and having some conversations to, again, have a hypothesis and either try to confirm it or deny it as you get into the year.
Yeah, it's my CTO is fond of saying, fail fast, fix fast. And that's what came to mind when you said that. We got the plan, but go out there and do it. So I wonder, here is part of that customer facing final question. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So what a lot of enterprise salespeople have been taught is we need to understand the customer's decision-making process. I could spend a lot of time talking about how customers are not doing a great job. They're actually making suboptimal decisions. They're not used to the complexity. And I heard another sales leader I know say, we're actually better at suggesting or prescribing how customers should buy and make a decision and evaluate who are the stakeholders, who are the criteria. And our job used to be understand their decision-making process. But I feel like the 2024 enterprise seller, and the way this gentleman put it is that customers are like veterinarians. There's a bird, a mouse, a frog that are all walking into their office all day long. And we're not only neurosurgeons, we're spine neurosurgeons. Like, we know we're selling firewall protection stuff. We know how good and bad decisions are made. And I feel like there's this massive opportunities for us to get more prescriptive to these customers about not why buy us, but the decision-making process for something like whatever it is you're selling, because we are much better at that. We are spine neurosurgeons and they are veterinarians. Any thoughts on that?
I could give you a different opinion on this one
Yeah.
depending on the day of the week when you ask me, because I think sometimes that really resonates with a customer, right? To say, hey, I know what is going on. I know this, but that's a hard thing to demonstrate. And it's a risky decision
Yes.
it's a risky decision to make there to
Yeah.
say to the customer, I know this better than you. You should make you should do X or you should do Y.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, I think increasingly what you may see in some organizations is you'll see people gravitate towards fields like procurement
Yeah.
where they're more comfortable like prodding someone to make a
Yeah.
decision like, hey, if we're going to do this, if we're going to start this project, we should do that. And I think that's going to be an interesting role as we increasingly see procurement departments. I spent the last 7 years selling to the public sector. So we've long worked with people in procurement. As you start to see those organizations exist and be more mature functions in even smaller commercial organizations, I think you'll see those operationally minded people, those people who are trying to construct the nerve centers of an organization, that are the operations functions of a product organization or a sales organization or a success organization. You'll see people who are natural decision makers start to succeed there because they know, again, we can agonize over vendors for 7 months, but that's 6 months that we
Yeah.
lost actually implementing and trying to make things work with the vendor we chose.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder. Sorry to those of us here who are sellers, but I've consulted to procurement organizations, and one of the things that blew me away is what they say to us, which is give me 5% more because your competitor just offered it or whatever, is way different. Every organization, and I'm going to say probably 15, probably Fortune 100 organizations that I've worked with in procurement, almost all use weighted attribute decision matrices to decide which one of us fit the needs of their internal stakeholders best. But they tell us, and most salespeople and sales leaders say all procurement cares about is price. And in fact, I happen to think they've got software that does this for them, that scores all the different solutions. They're not talking to us about that. And I think that would be a huge insight for a lot of salespeople to understand that most procurement organizations are actually making very, very well thought out. I think much better than the business. They're in the business of making decisions all day long, and they're good at it.
That's right. And a lot of times, just like I work in enablement, sometimes it can be viewed as a cost center. And the reality is it can be a productivity center to the business, and procurement organizations can be the same way because that's what they're supposed to be
Yes.
doing, right? Is making decisions, forcing people to move forward, and figure out what to do. And the more as a seller, I think we can embrace that wanting to talk to an individual in procurement, like wanting to talk to people who make decisions to guide them towards making one. I mean, even in a competitive decision, you talked about no decision earlier.
Yeah.
Even in a competitive decision making process, when you let it drag on, you let your time be wasted,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that's the late stage loss to a competitor after 4 months of waiting to hear is the worst. That's the worst loss in
Yes.
sales, right?
Yes.
Because not only did you fail to win the deal, but you spent months trying to figure out whether or not you were going to win, or maybe even doing things that ultimately weren't going to be accretive to a winning result.
And there you did it. As you and I were talking before, I love that word accretive, and I've resurrected it. Thank you for using it in the podcast. I
Yeah.
told you that when you and I were just chatting offline, that's such a cool word. So, I think about, there was in decision making, there's this classic letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote to someone who was asking him, like what decision to make. And there's a number of things in this letter, but he said the problem with decision making is all the reasons pro and con are not present in the mind at the same time, which all struck me. Like, we don't think about the decision we're making, maybe beyond gut or bias, and to get he said you can't do that with algebraic certainty, but you need to make an effort. And so what's interesting, what he told his friend is he said, I can't tell you what decision to make, but I can advise you on how to make the decision. And I think that's like the crux of what you and I are talking about is like, what's that? What is that approach? What is your approach? Yeah. How are you getting all the reasons pro and con present in your mind at the same time?
Yeah, and I love thinking about things as ultimately being like accretive because big decisions are, they may be treated as occurring in isolation. There's a lot of small decisions that were made that lead up to one large one. And there will be a series of small decisions after the fact of like, oh, we didn't anticipate this consequence. Now we have to figure out how do we deal with X or Y. And one of the best ways as a seller in the enterprise is to be there for those small decisions
Yes.
for your customers as well as for your internal teams, right? I think that's a really, really, again, an opportunity to drive situational leadership,
Yes.
demonstrate that practice, build that internal and external, personal brand equity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna close out this crazy enjoyable interview that I know I could actually do another 45 minutes with you, but you and I were again talking about this kind of before the recording about on a human level. I had mentioned Marie, my ops manager and friend who has her own site called Creating Today, and I use that where it's every day you wake up and I'm going to make the day happen. Now there's going to be some stuff you have no control over, but it's just making that conscious choice that I am going to create today versus letting today happen to me. And I love that idea. And clearly you live that way.
I'm trying to, yeah. That's all you can do, right? Is set that intention, and if you're going to have those days where you don't live up to it, but you decide to give yourself that forgiveness,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Give yourself the opportunity to do it again the next day.
Yeah. This has been
Just
so much
just like
fun.
sales, right?
Yeah, this has been so much fun, and yeah, if people haven't thought consciously about this, I really hope those who haven't had the huge benefit of decision making skills beyond our gut can get a chance to hear this and think more thoroughly about it. So thank you for today and for your prep. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Great to be with you, Brian.